Everybody, today we will be learning about the Missouri Compromise. Here are your video goals. Write down these questions and try to answer them as you watch the video. Alright, so let's talk about free states and slave states. So by 1820, slave states and free states were developing very differently. The people in the North who were wealthy put most of their money into factories, railroads, and canals, and this led the North to become very developed industrially. People in the South who had money put most of it into buying slaves and land. And so this made the North and the South look very different because the North was becoming a land of factories and railroads, while the South was becoming a land of slaves and plantations. This meant that northern and southern states disagreed on many political issues, especially the issue of the protective tariff. The North wanted tariffs to help the factories grow, but the South didn't want tariffs because they wanted to trade with Great Britain. This made the question of whether new states would allow slavery or not allow slavery really important, because the more states you have, the more power you have in the federal government. So in 1820, there was an even balance between slave states and free states. There were 11 free and 11 slave. What this meant was that the North and South had equal power in the Senate, but not in the House of Representatives, because the North, which had lots of cities, had way more people than the South. So they were tied in the Senate, but the North was stronger in the House of Representatives. Anyway, each side wanted to increase its power in the Senate by adding more states. The North wanted to add more free states, and the South wanted to add more slave states. So, when Missouri finally had enough people to become a state in 1820, the South demanded that it should be made a slave state, but the North wanted to keep it free. This led to deadlock in Congress. At first, the House of Representatives, which was dominated by northern states, sought to force Missouri to become a free state, even though there were already some slaves in Missouri. Southerners didn't want this because they wanted Missouri to become a slave state, so they blocked this move in the Senate. In order to break this tie in the Senate, Henry Clay, the same guy who came up with the American system, proposed the Missouri Compromise. And this compromise gave good stuff to both northern and southern states, so they could come to some kind of agreement. And here's what the Missouri Compromise said. There were basically three parts. Part one, Missouri would be allowed to become a slave state. This is what the Southerners really wanted, and it would be made so. Two, Maine would become a free state. So before this time, Maine had been kind of the northern chunk of Massachusetts. But what they were going to do is they were going to split Maine off from Massachusetts and turn it into a separate state. And what this meant is that there would still be an even balance between slave states and free states in the Senate. Now there would be 12 and 12 instead of 11 and 11. And finally, part three of the Missouri Compromise was that no more slave states would be allowed north of the 3630 line. And this is the line that was actually the southern border of Missouri. And so above that line, no more slavery would be allowed. But south of that line, slavery would still be allowed. Okay, and so this deal promised to keep the balance of free and slave states at least for the next few decades. And it settled the immediate problems between these two states, or these two parts of the country. But it doesn't solve the basic divide between free states and slave states. Basically, it's a short-term solution. It gets everybody working together again in the short term, but the big thing that divides the North and the South, which is slavery, is not going away. So what this means is that later on, if the balance between free states and slave states gets thrown off again, it will result in another disagreement much like the one caused by Missouri. So there's still trouble brewing in the United States in this disagreement between North and South, and the Missouri Compromise only resolves it temporarily. The disagreement between slave states and free states is going to come back with a vengeance in the next 30 years. Here are your video goals. Write down these questions and try to answer them as you watch the video.